Welcome everyone to our Scholars in Square lecture for this evening. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. As a reminder, our SITS format unfolds as follows. First, our speaker, Dr. Megan Swift, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then she will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Dr. Anna Zirkin, a political scientist originally from Russia. Anna holds a PhD in political science and is the co-author of Religious Communities in Moscow, History, Theology, Social Activity, commissioned by the Moscow Department of Multicultural Policy, Interregional Cooperation, and Tourism. After Megan and Anna talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a 20-minute open discussion period. Our speaker for this evening is Dr. Megan Swift. Megan is a professor of Russian Studies in the School of Languages, Linguistics and Cultures here at UVic, and this year's faculty fellow at CSRS. She is a specialist in Russian literature and cultural history. Her first book on children's reading under Lenin and Stalin won 2 book prizes in 2020. Her second publication is an edited volume on the cultural legacies of the 1917 revolution and came out in 2022. She and Anna, her conversation partner for today, collaborated on a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Eurasian Studies dedicated to Canada-Russia relations in 2021. They've also worked together on conferences at UVic dedicated to Russian security and media. So they are long-standing conversation partners. So it'll be an exciting conversation tonight. Now, as you all saw from the abstract for tonight's talk, because I know you read them, Megan is going to explore how after decades of suppression, the spiritual traditions of many Indigenous groups in the Russian Federation are experiencing a grassroots revival. Her talk will explore how the majority religious tradition, Russian Orthodoxy, is used and sometimes weaponized amidst and against the backdrop of this Indigenous spiritual revival. Now, this reminds us of the importance of acknowledging the lands we live on and the practices that, while perhaps experiencing a revival now, have been central to the ways of being for many Indigenous folks since time immemorial. And so I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, the Songhees and Wasepsum Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming Megan.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I'd like to begin by saying that I'm a specialist in Russian studies, and I've lived in Russia for various periods over the years, but I've always lived to the west of the Ural Mountains in what's known as European Russia. And so I have no lived experience of being in the Far East, which is one of the places that I'll be taking you to today. And so I'm especially grateful to the fact that my conversation partner is actually from the Far East, Anna Zirkin. She is coming from Kamchatka Peninsula, which is not exactly the Sakha Republic where I'll be taking you to. In fact, it's quite far from Sakha Republic, but at least it's a lot closer than Canada. So let's begin with this map of Russia. So the Russian Federation is divided into 8 federal districts. Its indigenous populations live mostly in the 2 large territories lying east of the Ural Mountains, the Siberian Federal District that you can see there in dark blue, and the Far Eastern Federal District, which is shown in brown. Taken all together, these areas are home to over 40 different indigenous groups, each with their own language and cultural traditions. Some of the peoples living there are transboundary, like the Sami, who have groups living in the territories of Sweden, Norway, and Finland, as well as Russia. The group known as the Nanai are also transborder. They live in both China and along the Amur River in Russia. And the Aleut people live in both Russia and Alaska. Although there are groups who practice Tibetan Buddhism and also Islam within the Siberian and Far Eastern districts, among the Buryats people and the Soyuz people, among others, shamanism was the original practice of the indigenous groups living here. Groups such as the Nenets, the Chukchi, Dolgans, Itelmens, Evenki, Orok, Taz, Hanti, Teleuts, Tofalars, and many others. Indigenous populations now form a minority amongst those who are living in Siberia and the Far East. They are number about 1.6 million among a total population of 32 million, so a very small minority. Their languages, cultures, and the shamanistic practices suffered under Russian conquest, colonization / Christianization, and then Sovietization. As in Canada, some groups have only a few living native speakers left, and their traditional cultures are very much in danger. Between 2000 and 2010, there was a new period of attention by the Russian state to the revitalization of Indigenous languages, but since then, no new federal policies have been put in place to protect endangered languages. In the 1930s and 40s and early 50s, which is bringing us into the Stalin era period, all of the Indigenous nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples were forcibly settled, and shamanism was banned. This was done under two rubrics. The first one was collectivization, which was the program to turn all agriculture into state-run farms, where the workers were obliged to deliver a certain percentage of their yields at lower than market prices. And then the second one was the anti-religious campaigns of the Soviet Union, which was officially atheist. Although the multiple ethnicities and the multiple languages of the USSR were officially celebrated, beginning from the foundation of the Soviet Union, by the 1950s, the children of Indigenous populations were being sent away for schooling and for Russification. And there are some parallels between the Canadian and Russian during the Soviet Union experience, but also some very important historical differences. What we would call residential schools in the Soviets called boarding schools. The word shaman actually originates from Siberia and Central Asia. The Dictionary of Cultural Anthropology from 2018 defines a shaman as an individual who enters into a trance state to mediate between human and spirit worlds in healing and divination ceremonies. The shamanism practiced by the indigenous groups of Siberia and the Far East derive historically from an ancient Central Asian mother religion that was called Tengrism. Actually is called Tengrism because there's a few very small practitioners, a small percentage of practitioners. On the Russian census, the religions of these areas are termed neo-pagan and Tengrist, as you can see on this pie chart here. And you can also see that the vast majority of the population of Russia identify as Russian Orthodox. There's a very, very small slice there in light green, 2%, which identifies as neo-pagan and Tengrist. And that small 2% slice includes the indigenous shamanistic religions. So this practice centers around a three-tiered cosmology containing an upper world of deities, a middle world where humans and animals and area spirits are found, and then a lower world of demons. And shamans work as the intermediaries and interpreters between the spirit world and the human world. They restore imbalances and bad relationships between those three domains, between the upper, the middle, and the lower domains. In traditional indigenous Siberian and Far Eastern cultures, the shamans were called in to heal illnesses and disease. They could foretell the future and ward off plagues and famines, and they did so by entering into a dream trance and traveling between the human and the spirit world. And shamans can be either women practitioners or men practitioners. Shamanism, however, was virtually wiped out during the Soviet period. It was banned, but it experienced a large revival in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, and hence the fall of state atheism. So the period of decline and collapse for the Soviet Union was simultaneously a period of revival and renewal for the indigenous peoples of Siberia and the Far East. My talk today is going to focus on the religious resurgence of the Sakha people, whose Sakha Autonomous Republic accounts for approximately half of the huge, enormous area of the Far Eastern Federal District, which is a very prosperous republic. It has among its natural resources oil, natural gas, and diamonds. The Sakha, who are also called the Yakut in Russian, and their autonomous republic is called Yakutia, are an exception amongst the indigenous peoples who who live in these areas that I've shown you, Siberia and the Far Eastern Federal Republic, because they are not so-called, this is what how Russians identify the indigenous populations, they're not small numbered people. They number over 500,000, which is quite a large group. Their capital, or the capital of Sakha Republic, is Yakutsk. It has a population of 355,000, so it's somewhat analogous to Victoria. And it has the honor of being the coldest city on Earth, with an average annual temperature of -8 degrees Celsius. The language of Sakha people, what they call Sakha Tila, unlike most of the other 40+ indigenous languages of this area, is not an endangered language. According to a 2021 report, 95% of Sakha people speak Sakha as their first language, and they are also bilingual in Russian. Sakha Republic has 3 main climatic and vegetation zones. It's permafrost in the north, it's mossy tundra in the middle zone of the area, and it's boreal forested taiga in the south. The area became part of the Russian Empire in the 17th century under Tsar Mikhail Romanov. And as you can see, it's geographically a beautiful land of lakes, rivers, mountain ranges, islands, and peninsulas. The largest river of the area is known as the Lena River, and that's the river that Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin got his revolutionary nickname from. So he was exiled to Siberia. He was a political prisoner in Siberia and took the name Lenin from there. His real last name was Ulyanov. So in downtown Yakutsk, the institutional expression of Sakha shamanism is this temple of purification, or house of purification, which is a grouping of 3 white yurts with a carved wooden world tree inside at its center. And this is a relatively recent addition to the city, having been established in 2002. But another and an important marker of the post-1991, so post-collapse of communism upsurge in ethnic and religious revival in Sakha Republic is the popularity of the traditional festivals that you can see here on the slide, which are known as the yaks. At these festivals, the Sakha gather for traditional circle dancing, for prayer singing, for games and sports, and they have special traditional sports. They include wrestling, and also horse racing is a traditional sport, and eating and drinking traditional foods. And the special drink of this festival is kumis, which is a drink of fermented mare's milk. The biggest yak of the year is held in celebration of summer solstice, so June 21st, and it's attended by hundreds of thousands of people, largely Sakha, but also Russian and tourists. And this is what originally drew me to this topic, which is the statistically significant number of people that are attending this festival, which features shamans and prayers and rituals. It attracts annually just around 200,000 people, which would be the equivalent of the entire population of Victoria City, plus the entire population of Saanich, coming together for a 2-day and 1-night festival featuring shamans and prayers and cultural traditions. So to be clear, the Iyakh itself, or the festival, was not banned during the Soviet period. In fact, it was co-opted to spread Marxism-Leninism. With shamans and shamanism banned, however, the Iyakh was emptied out of its former spiritual meaning, which was a welcoming back and blessing of the summer abundance of the natural world. Soviet events were often mass events, like you see here, but even at their peak, the Soviet era Iyaks were not attracting this enthusiastic number of participants and visitors. So whether we call this a cultural revival, or whether we call this a spiritual revival, or whether we call it a religious revival, it's clearly an important testimony to the rise of ethno-nationalism. And that was a current which was one of the contributing factors to the breakdown of the Soviet Union in 1991. But that was at the Union Republic level. So now independent countries like Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan were formerly republics of the Soviet Union. And the multiple colors that are shown on the map on this slide, were all once part of the larger entity, the larger dark red entity of the Soviet Union. Sakha Republic is administratively an autonomous republic, a name that designates recognition of a different cultural heritage, not of autonomous decision-making about its own sovereignty. As the autonomous Republic of Chechnya discovered for itself in the 1990s. In the 1990s, under Yeltsin, Sakha Republic bolstered its economic sovereignty, demanding more self-decision-making around their budget and around their own affairs, but without going as far as Chechnya did in the 1990s, if you remember news reports, and declaring independence, which ultimately was denied. But under Putin in the 2000s, all references to sovereignty in the constitution of Sakha Republic have been removed. All of that language has been removed. So my biggest question when I first started to look into this topic was at what point this upsurge of ethno-cultural and religious practices would begin to, and if it would, at what point it would painfully rub up against the majority Russian Orthodox culture. So Russian Orthodoxy, as you remember from the pie chart, is still the majority religion of the Russian Federation. And it's also still the majority religion of Sakha Republic. Officially, 38% of the republic is Russian Orthodox, 26% claims itself as being atheist, and only 13% of everybody, of the residents practice Sakha shamanism. And just to give you an idea of the numbers we're talking about, there's 1 million people that live in the republic, and about half of those are ethnically Sakha, so about 500,000 people, and then 355,000 living in the capital. So the Russian Federation is a multi-faith state, and the post-Soviet constitution, which was adopted in 1993, guarantees freedom of religion, ensuring that citizens have the right to worship as they choose. However, in practice, Russian Orthodoxy enjoys a privileged position and an influential position, and it's the first among the religions, the official religions practiced in the Russian Federation. Since 2009, which was almost a decade into what is now a 26-year Putin presidency, we've seen an increasingly close relationship between the Putin state and the Russian Orthodox Church under its leader, Patriarch Kirill. Furthermore, we've seen the weaponization of religion as one of the justifications given for Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The Putin state used a faith-based claim to Ukrainian territory, among other reasons cited for the invasion, citing the medieval kingdom of Rus, where Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians shared a common capital, which was Kiev, a common ruler, and common lands from the late 9th to mid 13th centuries. In 1589, a patriarch of Moscow and all Rus was named, giving Russia a status equal to that of the ancient churches of Rome and Jerusalem and Constantinople. But unlike the Catholic Church, Western Christianity, which has a pope at the head of all the churches, the Orthodox Church has a collective of 14 autocephalous churches, which means self-governing churches, and each one is governed by its own patriarch. In terms of the war in Ukraine, the difficulty lies in the fact that the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, who was elected in 2009, is officially at the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has a metropolitan, and you can see here Anufried, but no patriarch of its own. Meanwhile, most of Russian Orthodoxy's sacred sites are located in Kiev, which was the capital of ancient Rus. In 2009, Patriarch Kirill began visiting those Orthodox holy sites in Kiev and in Crimea, making it clear that what he calls the one space of the Russian Orthodox Church includes Ukraine, Belarus, and all Orthodox immigrant communities. In Ukraine, it's a somewhat confusing picture of Orthodoxy because there is also a almost identically named Orthodox Church of Ukraine, not to be confused with Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which came under the Patriarchate of Constantinople, but was granted autocephaly or self-governance in 2019. And then there is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, the one that I'm speaking of, which has not been granted independence from Moscow. In fact, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate has more parishes than the other church. It has some 12,000 parishes in Ukraine, which is almost twice the number of the self-governing Orthodox Church of Ukraine of the Kiev Patriarchate. So Russian Patriarchate provided a religious pretext for the invasion of Ukraine, essentially saying that there's no distinction between Ukrainian Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy, and also there is no substantive distinction between Ukrainian and Russian territory. The official website of the Russian Orthodox Church proclaimed the slogan "In defense of the unity of the Russian Orthodox Church" and featured on its website both a Russian and Ukrainian flag. And this put Kiev's Metropolitan Onufriy in a difficult situation with his nominal boss, as you can imagine. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Onufriy condemned the war and was public about his support for the Ukrainian armed forces, but ultimately he refused to declare the independence of his church from Moscow, even after the Ukrainian government under Zelensky demanded that he do so. And this is just one of the many fallouts resulting from the complicated mingling of religion and war in the Putin state. But my question is, what happens if you use a faith-based justification for war, as we've seen here, and then you call upon a multi-faith population to fight? What happens if Putin skillfully crafts a premise for territorial expansion that's based, among other things, on the unity of the Slavic ethnicity, Slavic being Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, but then you call upon non-Slavic ethnicities to buy into that reasoning, especially if in places like Sakha Republic, cultural and spiritual revival is at its highest point in a century. And the answer is that this is what happens. This is the Free Yakutia Foundation Telegram channel, and Telegram is analogous to Instagram. And you'll recall that Yakutia is the name that's also used for Sakha Republic. And this is a Telegram channel that counts the dead from those who have gone to war and have become casualties of war. This is a post from December 2nd, 2025, and is titled "They Lived and Died Under Putin," and it's dedicated to the 9 newest casualties of war from Sakha Republic. So Free Yakutia Foundation was established in 2022 at the start of the war, the same year as the invasion of Ukraine, by Sakha Republic native Sergilana Kondakova, who is currently living in Melbourne, and as I've seen now looking her up, has been declared a traitor to Russia, and a warrant is out for her arrest if she returns. At the time of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin said that the war would not be fought by conscripts, it would be fought by volunteers. But since then, conscription or mobilization drives have been used. And as of January 2026, the age of eligible service has been raised to 40 years old. Kondakova is herself native of Sakha Republic, but she's one of the minority indigenous peoples, not Sakha. She's from the Yugakir people in Sakha Republic. And she charges that in 2022, Sakha men were in fact over-conscripted to the tune of 8,000 men in a republic of 1 million people. And she's joined by scholars and journalists who point out that non-Russian ethnic minorities are statistically conscripted and killed at a much higher percentage than ethnic Russians in the war. Each of the republics of the Russian Federation are mandated to meet conscription norms, and the studies have shown that the smaller and more remote a town is from regional centers, especially from city centers, the larger the quota it receives for military enlistment. And so even if ethnic minorities are not targeted specifically, it disproportionately affects ethnic minorities who tend to live in these areas. Furthermore, a small but steady number of Sakha men have become asylum seekers now, and I'll probably end on this note because we're running out of time. Much closer to home, and I'll probably leave this topic for tomorrow at our coffee talk. But here is something surprising that came out of my research, which is the number of asylum seekers who have found their way to Linwood, Washington, just across the border from us. Most of the studies that are being done on the resurgence of shamanism under Putin have been done in fields like ethnography and anthropology, but I wanted to draw attention to some of the important implications of that for cultural history and political history in Russia. Thank you very much.
I can come and join. All right. Well, thank you very much, Megan. It is a very interesting topic, and thank you so much, Rachel, for bringing me in from the ashes of the academia in both worlds. And I guess for a full disclaimer, I should mention that I moved from Kamchatka when I was 16. So I did remember, and in our conversation with Megan beforehand in advance, that I did take part in some indigenous ceremonies back then, but I definitely don't have a very good recollection of how things were. And I remember I liked them a lot and they were very well attended, but I definitely cannot say if there were some, religious traditions brought up per se, or if it was more cultural. And the other interesting fact before we begin our conversation, I wanted to mention when I co-authored that book that Rachel mentioned in 2014, there were no indigenous religions registered in Moscow because the book was based on field studies. We did go and talk with all the communities that were either registered in Moscow as religious community or were on the sort of almost registered, collecting documents to be registered. So none of those were indigenous, which actually brings me to my first question and the conversation point. I wanted to bring us back to the question of definitions. Megan did mention that there were approximately 40 indigenous groups in the far east of Russia and in Siberia. However, in Russian context, there are two definitions that are used. So one definition is so-called peoples of Russia. And overall, according to the census that Megan mentioned, there are approximately 190 ethnic groups that form the territory of Russia. So those peoples of Russia. And you include peoples that people are part of that definition. And then there are other groups that, based on the current legislature, there is a list of those groups that are called, if we translate it directly from Russian, that would be small in number indigenous people. So that definition goes kind of in parallel with that peoples of Russia. There are 47 of those small in number indigenous groups. So I was wondering, Megan, so what would you consider then indigenous in the context of Russia, and in tying it back into our topic, religious revitalization? So what religions really are we considering as being, on that in that process of revitalization?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, there's two things that I want to bring out from your question. The first is the definition of peoples of Russia. So Russia uses different terminology than we do when defining indigeneity and in defining the multi-ethnic groups that form in Russia. So we mentioned, and you also mentioned, the small numbered people. They're called the small numbered. It's малочисленный коренной народ, or ethnos, right? Yeah. So I want to draw attention to the word коренной. Okay, so in Russian, it's coming from the word roots, and this is the word that we would translate, I think, as indigenous. Yeah. So in the Russian perspective, the definition would be a people that has for centuries been in this land.
Yeah.
Whereas to use the comparison point with Canada, Indigenous would mean also people who have had been for centuries and their ancestors are on this land, but also denoting there before colonization.
Mhm.
And I think in Russia, it's a much more complex picture because we have, just because of the specific historical process. So for instance, when we were talking in our conversation prior to this, we were talking about the Crimean Tatar people who have been, who are Muslim and originating from Crimea, as you can probably guess from their name. And they have been in Crimea for approximately somewhere between 500 and 600 years.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually referred to as indigenous to that area, although actually there were people that were there before that. But in the Russian context, it's even more complicated because then they were deported by Stalin. They were one of many ethnicities that were deported, taken from Crimea, and then deported to Siberia, where some of them stayed. And so, as you rightly point out, Russia has its own definitions. Like for instance, even the definition of ethnos or narod, they're used, I think, synonymously now. An ethnos and a people, and that suggests shared language, shared culture, shared religious practices. But the small numbered ones, actually, you are the one who mentioned this, that they the fact of being small numbered allows them to have special protection of their languages and their cultures from the state itself.
Yeah, more sort of a little bit more than what goes into peoples of Russia, because that lack of, their languages are not necessarily that endangered, as you mentioned, right? In terms of Saha people, where most of them, they do speak their language.
A remarkable 95%, like really remarkable. Yeah.
And then they also have special statuses in the federation itself, as you mentioned. Saha is an autonomous republic, right? Then we can talk about Tatarstan, Chechnya, Buryatia, and others as well. So, which not only differentiates them as unique cultures, right, but also gives them certain opportunities to, educate people in school, in their own languages. For example, my husband is from Tatarstan, even though he's moved, which is in a Hungarian group, also small numbered, I'm guessing. And his passport, Russian passport, is in Russian and Tatar, while my Russian passport is just Russian, right? So there are certain things that those autonomous republic can do that other people cannot, and including those small and numbered indigenous people, because they are scattered across different territories.
Yeah, and I wanted to make sure that I mention, while we still have time, that we have a colleague of ours at UVic who's coming from the Telmans people working in the Department of Anthropology, a colleague of Rachel's, who her project is focusing on revitalization of the Telmans language, and she created a film that I saw at Cinecenta. I think it was about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago. That is the origin story of the Telmans people. That for the first time she created it with her team, and created a translation, Russian, English, and Telman, their origin story.
Much.
Yeah.
And the other question I have that was more of a broader nature was about religions. You did mention that there are several of them. You also showed us the pie chart. And so, again, in the Russian context, 4 religions are usually considered traditional. Basically also, and by traditional, I guess they mean religions that are on the land, or
quite a long time, right? And it is pre-Soviet, usually Imperial Russia, right? So, and they are Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism. And so I was wondering, you did mention that you were wondering about, how this revitalization of indigenous religion would be rubbing against the Orthodox Christianity. However, in some cases, and especially I'm thinking Tuva or Buryatia, it would be rubbing against Buddhism, right? So I was wondering about that. So what do you think? And have you seen anything about that? Any insights that you might have?
I haven't seen any painfully rubbing against, to use that academic phrase, against in the republics or autonomous republics that are majority Buddhist, and Tibetan Buddhist, we should mention, is the strain of Buddhism. And some of these places were actually visited by the Dalai Lama in the 1990s, which is interesting. In those places, the percentage of people practicing shamanism are really tiny, like 8% or 2%, like really tiny. So I think there might not be as much opportunity for painful rubbing up against interruption. But in terms of the 4 pillars, when we were talking before, I was thinking a bit more about it last night. And I think one of the big differences is that those 4 religions, the 4 foundation religions, are all institutional in the sense that they have a center and actually a material physical space that, like a church or a mosque, which represents a place of gathering. Whereas in shamanism, indigenous shamanism in Siberia, one of the things that distinguishes it is that it didn't have this physical center. Like, it was coming from a people that were nomadic, semi-nomadic, so it was always moving around. And this temple, the House of Purification, is actually unusual because it represents an institutional center which has really never existed before. And
they represent it with a yurt. And the yurt, as in a way, is also a nomadic, temporary structure.
Yeah, and apparently this is in downtown Yakutsk, really just across the same street but down from the main Russian Orthodox Church. And when it went up in 2002, the Metropolitan who was there said it's okay that it's a bit, wasn't 100% okay, but as long as the Russian Orthodox spire is higher than the yurt, it can go in. Yeah.
Well, and it is actually not an exception in the Russian context, because there are so many, places, Kazan, for example, you would have a mosque and an Orthodox church, in the Kremlin there in Kazan, side by side. Even in Moscow, in some of the districts of Moscow, same story. Like, it would have one kind of area, and there is a church and there is a mosque.
Yeah, and I think Russia is a multi-faith federation, and it was a multi-faith empire as well. Like, that's just one of the founding features of this. But to go back to the pie chart, if we talk about 4 pillars, one of the pillars is a lot thicker than the other pillars. Like 42% pillar versus 8%. I think it's 6% Muslim, and then 8 is other.
Well, but if we go back to the pie chart, actually, the second pillar would be atheists.
Yes.
Which is pretty close to the number of Orthodox people that call themselves Orthodox. So that would be the 5th column.
That's the 5th column, which is only natural. That's a legacy of the Soviet Union of atheism. Yeah.
And
September, one more quick question.
yes, one more quick question. So going back to the Sakha people,
Yeah.
right? So I was wondering, because as you mentioned that not only Sakha people live there, there are other small numbered indigenous groups
Yeah.
like events, Evanks, Yukaghirs, and Chukchi even, I believe, right? So what about their traditions and how do they integrate in the small shamanism structure? Do they have them separate or is it all together? So how does that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think that one of the interesting features of Siberian shamanism is that it's not proselytizing religion or an evangelizing religion. So it's not trying to convert people, but it's also not trying to keep people out. So if they're having the celebrations, it's very welcoming and open. But the other smaller numbered peoples, if they're practicing shamanism, are also practicing their own kind of shamanism with their own tales in their own language, following their own traditions. With, as far as I know, respect for those traditions carrying on. Yeah, you're
Great, well, thank you. Right, so now we can open up to the room for a broader conversation. More questions? Yeah, Francis. Okay.
Yeah, I two questions. One was, it was interesting that there is rather little shamanism in the Buryat dominated regions,
Yeah.
because Buryat Buddhism is so heavily based on shamanism.
Yes.
So I wonder whether there's some kind of transfer there. And the second question I had was, in many indigenous areas globally, the evangelical and charismatic churches have made huge inroads. And then you talked most entirely about the institutional framework of the Orthodox Church, but is there a Pentecostal and charismatic and evangelical?
Yeah. We had a great conversation about that yesterday that we weren't able to get to today, but this is a major feature of what happened culturally after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. When state atheism was over, one of the responses was that the Western evangelical churches sent in all of their representatives, thinking that this would be a population that was just ready to be converted. And so in the 1990s, there was lots of visitation from these churches to the former Soviet Union, and there was some uptake. But as you can see, the majority, well, 42% is not over 50, but the largest chunk remained.
And what kind of percentage then would follow evangelical churches?
Well, it would be in the other, so very small, under 10%. But to come to your question about Buryatia, I don't know a huge amount about Buryatia, but I do know that, as you mentioned, it's Tibetan Buddhist is the majority religion. They do have what's called yellow shamanism. Yellow shamanism is a mix of Buddhism and shamanism. So obviously that's coming from populations that are living next to each other and mixing traditions.
Yeah, and Tibetan shamanism, Buddhism is in any case intensely shamanistic.
Yeah.
Good question. Peter.
Thanks very much for this. Do you get a sense, or I got a sense from one or two of the photos, that there's also a racial sort of, there are within Yakuts, there would be, I'm not sure if the term is old, white Russians would be either atheist or Orthodox, and the native, more Asiatic people would be shamanistic.
Not 100%, actually. A lot of Sakha people would be atheist, also following the 70-year period of the Soviet Union. And I should also mention that the practice of Sakha religion, if you want to call it that, is sometimes taken as simply cultural, not religious. So for instance, shamans can be called like, it's sort of integrated into post-Soviet Putin Russia life very easily. has rebounded very easily. So if you're getting married, you might have a civil ceremony like in City Hall, but then you might invite the shaman just to come and to give a blessing. And it might not be part of your religious practice, but it's a cultural practice to you. You could even have like you're opening a new mall in Yakutsk and the shaman comes to do a blessing for the mall. So it's really been very easily integrated into just everyday life and modern life.
Molly.
I'm curious about like when you say like 42% is Russian Orthodox, like what that actually looks like. If that's people who are like really committed and like
Yes.
there every week, or if it's like that's just the box that you check.
Yeah.
And then sort of like connected to that, because I'm assuming that like the shamanic traditions are not like, you know, you can only be this one tradition, right? Because if people see it as more cultural, and if there's syncretism that's rising out of that, or there's people who might describe themselves as Orthodox but also are participating in some of these festivals and stuff.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because as you know, when people are polled in Canada, if they're asked whether they're religious, they usually say no. And if you ask them if they're spiritual, they usually say yes. So when you ask people, do you regularly attend church? That's a different question. And it tends to be nowhere near as large as the people who are saying that they have a spiritual practice or they're. If Russia is the same thing. The people who identify as Russian Orthodox are not necessarily people who are going to church every single weekend or for the services. One of the interesting questions that came up when Anna and I were talking is that if this tradition of shamanism was broken during the Soviet period, where did the new shamans come from? So traditionally, shamans were in families. It wasn't necessarily passed down father to son, but they tended to be in families. And shamanism is considered to be a calling, like it calls out to a person who goes through, tends to hear voices from the spirit world and tends to go through a process of becoming a shaman. However, now, and starting in the 1990s, when all these evangelical churches were pouring into Russia, there was a real upsurge in interest in New Age religion, New Age spirituality. And there was a very interesting TV personality and religious personality called Kashpirovsky, who did mass hypnotisms, which was incredibly popular in the 1990s. So this was something you can imagine a population hadn't seen anything like this for a long time. And things like seances, hypnotism, all of that became very popular in the 1990s. And so now you can also, for people who are just interested, and you don't even have to be Saha, if you're just interested, you can actually take courses to become a shaman. So you can get a certificate, and it's like a new age thing. And then they actually, the people who learn by course, the word in Russian is extra sense, which is coming from like your extra sense, right? In English. And even if you're going to a shaman for rituals or services, because these services they're paid for, the words that would be used would be like healing. It would be new age words, healing energy, removing negative energy. It would be something that the person who's coming for the service would recognize as almost, maybe it's too much to say a spa treatment, but you know, that they would be using, yeah, or like, yeah, like you were you might even say, I'm working with your chakras, something like the vocabulary would be borrowed from all kinds of things, but it would be the same types of healing ceremonies that are traditional, but it would be aimed towards a clientele that is identifying with a new age spirituality.
And is that like the majority of what it's looking like now, or this is just like a subset of the sort of shamanistic practices?
Well, the one that I showed you here at the festival, that's traditional. So that's the prayers that are traditional. That's telling that their origin story is called the Alankho. It was written down in the last several decades and sung. It's like a multi-part epic. those are traditional. But if you can also go and visit a shaman for healing.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mm.
Yeah. Other questions, Martin? Please.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the last note that you sort of ended on, which indicated at least some awareness of possible discrimination against the Indigenous peoples in terms of recruitment and so on. And I'm just wondering to what extent there's some kind of, is there any hint amongst these people of dissent against the Russian state and its imperialist kind of ambitions? I think you mentioned the Sami, who sort of are in other states adjacent to the Russian Federation. And then on that, just one final point, are there indigenous groups within the Ukraine itself that we didn't talk about that at all? So I'm completely ignorant of the field, so I'm just all ears at this point.
Yeah, those are really good questions. I'm not sure I can answer the Ukrainian one really well. I don't know. I would have to find out and get back to you about that one. But about the overconscription of ethnicities, I mentioned that it's a fact, as far as we can tell. First of all, there can't be reporting about it really openly in Russia, right? So what numbers are being taken are coming from official numbers, like mobilization numbers. But what I've discovered about it, what I mentioned is that it's probably not aimed specifically at ethnic minorities, but mobilization drives are happening in places where people are less educated, so they're getting scooped up. Like literally, the police are going into some place, standing at a train station. There's people getting off a train and they're being scooped up. Press gang. Yeah, press gang. Yeah. And it's happening far from city centers for where people might not know their rights as well, where they might not be as influential, where they might. So the statistics that are known show that conscription is happening in far greater numbers outside of the centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg. But at the same time, it's a complicated picture because there's plenty of ethnic Russians who aren't feeling great about being conscripted either. And not necessarily happy to go fight in the war either. And about the Ukrainian indigenous populations, I'll have to get back to you.
Yeah, Matt.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, my hand wasn't even up yet.
Oh,
Wow.
I sensed it. I sensed it.
It's just about time.
Yeah, so my question has to do with the self-conception of Indigenous people in the regions that you're looking at in relation to the non-Indigenous people in Russia, and how that relates, for example, to other conceptions of indigeneity, say, for example, in Germany. So in my experience in Germany, there's a long history of this relationship via the author Karl May, late 19th, early 20th century, wrote a bunch of best-selling novels, The Adventures of Winnetou, a made-up Apache warrior. And this has created generations of obsession, what some call Indian enthusiasm, in Germany, which is identifying specifically with North American indigeneity. Similarly, the North American Indigenous Studies Association, they had their conference in Bodo in Norway in 2023. And so there's connections with the Sami there and North American indigeneity. And I'm wondering if any of those associations happen in Russia, or is there a difference?
Yeah, I know that
way
there's
of understanding
been. I know that there has been visits between groups between Far Eastern Russia and Alaska, for instance, like gatherings together. But I wasn't sure when you first asked your question. Conceptions of the self of indigenous peoples. Do you mean ethnic Russians, or you said non-indigenous?
Well, both. I mean, I'm making the case that North American indigeneity is overrepresented, I think, in a global conception of indigeneity. And I'm wondering to what extent that's true in Russia among the people you're talking about, or if there's something a little bit different.
Yeah, I think it's something a little bit different, although I will say that the literature of the North American Wild West was actually quite popular, at least in children's literature, which is something that I'm always looking into. But I was really struck by, for instance, Saha people, how much pride and knowledge in their own language and traditions and so on there is. And I don't think that's looking at other traditions. I think that's very much held within that group. Yeah.
Do we have any online?
There's a question here from Jessica. She asks, can you clarify further, does the practice of shamanism refer to the shaman, a singular person, or the appreciation / cultural engagement with shamanism, such as the mall blessing or a large festival? In other words, are all people who engage with shamanism considered shamans? And then B, and that was, what are the living conditions in the autonomous zones?
Okay.
Are they in some way comparable to First Nations reserves in Canada?
Okay. Is this from Jessica?
Or Jessica.
Okay, hi Jessica. Yes, so I mentioned that there was two strands of shamanism. So one is the inherited one, that is, and then there's the learned one, and the learned one might be someone who's not even Saka ethnicity. So but the inherited one, at least speaking about this group, is definitely Saka ethnicity. So I think anybody who's engaging in, no, if you're at the mall and you happen to be in the presence of the shaman opening the mall with blessings, I don't think that means that you're practicing shamanism. Yeah. And then what was the other question?
The conditions of the autonomous zones.
Oh,
are they comparable to
yeah.
First Nation reserves?
At least Saha Republic, no, not comparable at all. It's a relatively wealthy city, and urban, and the living conditions are quite good. Yeah. As for some other smaller numbered peoples, maybe in the villages and so on, but there's not a reserves system, or there wasn't one historically. So that's another one of the historical specificities that's not quite the same as Canada. Yeah.
So I have a question which has two parts.
Yes.
Practice of shamanism and its relation with the sacredness of the land, where these indigenous people there are located.
Yeah.
And second, if it's coming from global popular imagination, especially new age thingy like yoga, for example, or erotica that we see coming from the other side of the world to this world.
Yeah.
Are there quote unquote learned shamans over here in Canada who are bringing Russian shamanistic practices to the market for selling?
Yeah. That's a very good question. So the first part of your question, I think that there's parts of the landscape that are considered to be more sacred. There's special lakes and especially caverns, cave openings, special rock formations, special trees that where the spirit voices are stronger. And if you are around those physical areas, that's part of becoming a shaman. You're being drawn to those spaces, and that's where you're hearing the voices. I've never met a shaman over here, but that's not to say that there aren't any. But I mean, a Saha shaman. But there are plenty of people who are who would call themselves shaman who are here in Victoria, who are doing. It usually has to do with psychotropic drug. Evenings, and sometimes taking a group of people out into nature, and it also is very involved with healing, especially trauma and fear, and but they're not Saha people.
They'll stay back in their own sacred landscape.
As far as I know, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
They're not, but that's part of the non-evangelical part of it, right? They're not interested in converting the world to Saha shamanism there. Yeah.
And yet this is a celebration that's happening in Washington. Would there have been some sort of shaman who was leading this?
Yes. So the woman that you see in the picture is Saha, and she's married to the American guy who is in the hat there. And what's interesting about about this group is that the latest arrivals are escaping military service.
Okay, last quick question here before we have to close out. I was wondering, is there any research on how some of these traditional religions got absorbed into like folk culture? Like I can speak from my experience, like my family's from Ukraine. I grew up in Ukraine around Kiev, and there was a lot of talk like in the village, like my grandma would say, you know, you can't let this lady, you know, like get a hold of your hair because she's gonna do something with it.
Yeah.
Like there's still these beliefs
Yeah.
that despite the atheism, despite the Eastern Orthodoxy, like these practices, they persist. That there's a lot of things, and interestingly enough, I was talking with a Cree woman back home, and we even have a few beliefs that are similar. Like you don't walk over someone who is sitting because you're taking their life force away. And there was a few others, I can't call them to mind, but I was so curious, and especially like in Orthodoxy, at least I know during springtime, there's the one like holiday, I think it's like close to Lent, where you have to collect these herbs and put them around your door.
Yeah.
But originally it was to stop like the mermaids from the Dnieper to come in.
Yes.
Like that's where it originated
Rusalki?
from. Yeah, the Rusalki. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just so curious about how many of these indigenous religions might have just gotten absorbed and transformed over into folk culture. And like, is there any studies on that?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. And so pre-Orthodox, what you're referring to is pagan, Russian paganism, which, like as you said, when the Slavic peoples took on Christianity, they didn't fully abandon the pagan beliefs. They just sort of naturally brought along the pagan beliefs into Christianity. There was no massive conflict between the two. And so you still have what's Nahar's Naharka? How would you translate that? Like a healer in the village. And a lot of these folk beliefs that we might call superstitions, or we might call knock on wood, or like evil eye, right? That somebody is sending ill intentions, bad wishes towards you, and that could be very dangerous. And then in pagan Russian beliefs, you would use you would have somebody who could protect you from the evil eye. You could say certain prayers or do certain rituals so that you could fend off the evil eye. So it would absolutely make sense if some of these traditions in the Far East were also just absorbed into culture. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So we're off next week because it is reading week, but you can join us the following Thursday, same time, same place, to hear from our graduate fellow, Sarah Madsen, who's going to talk about conspiracy, Catholicism, and the courts during this popish plot crisis. So join us for that. And